In January of 1945, American military intelligence received a piece of information so alarming that it triggered one of the most daring rescue missions of the entire Pacific War. Weeks earlier, on the island of Palawan, Japanese guards had herded American prisoners of war into air raid shelters and set them on fire, murdering the men rather than risk their liberation as American forces advanced. With similar advances now underway in the Philippines and a camp at Cabanatuan holding more than 500 American prisoners, many of them survivors of the Bataan Death March who had already endured nearly 3 years of brutal captivity, American commanders faced a stark and urgent calculation. If nothing was done, the men at Cabanatuan might suffer the exact same fate before American forces could ever reach them through conventional advance. What followed was a raid conducted 30 miles behind enemy lines, planned and executed in a matter of days, that would become one of the most successful prisoner rescue operations in American military history. This is the story of what happened to the men rescued at Cabanatuan, and the desperate race against time that saved them from a massacre that had already claimed other American prisoners just weeks before. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How do you rescue 500 starving, often barely mobile prisoners from a guarded camp deep behind enemy lines, without alerting the enemy in time for them to do to Cabanatuan's prisoners exactly what had already been done at Palawan? The broader military situation in the Philippines by January of 1945 had shifted decisively in America's favor, with General Douglas MacArthur's forces having successfully landed at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon in early January, and beginning the drive that would eventually liberate Manila and the remainder of the archipelago. An advance that, while bringing genuine hope of eventual liberation to prisoners held throughout the islands, also created exactly the specific danger the Cabanatuan raid was organized to prevent, since Japanese forces retreating or facing encirclement had already demonstrated at Palawan a documented willingness to murder prisoners rather than allow their liberation. It is worth remembering, when considering the raid's ultimate success, just how thoroughly it depended on a foundation of trust and cooperation between American forces and Filipino guerrilla resistance networks that had been building continuously since the Philippines fell to Japanese occupation years earlier. Relationships forged through years of clandestine resistance activity, intelligence gathering, and mutual risk-sharing that made the kind of close, high-stakes tactical partnership the Cabanatuan raid required possible in a matter of days, rather than requiring the extended relationship building that establishing this level of trust would ordinarily demand. The Cabanatuan prison camp held a population of American prisoners whose journey to that specific location traced back, for a substantial number of them, directly to the Bataan Death March itself. Men who had survived the brutal 65-mile forced march in April of 1942, survived the catastrophic early months at Camp O'Donnell, and had subsequently been transferred to Cabanatuan, where they had now endured nearly 3 additional years of malnutrition, disease, and forced labor under continuing Japanese captivity. By January of 1945, these men existed in a state of severe physical deterioration, many suffering from the cumulative effects of years of inadequate food and medical care. A population whose physical condition alone would make any rescue operation considerably more complicated than a conventional military action against able-bodied combatants. The specific details of the Palawan killing, in which Japanese guards forced roughly 150 American prisoners into crude air raid shelters before dousing the structures with fuel and setting them ablaze, with guards shooting or bayoneting any prisoners who managed to escape the flames, reached American intelligence through the accounts of a small number of prisoners who miraculously survived by escaping into the surrounding jungle and eventually making contact with Filipino guerrilla forces. Testimony that provided American commanders with a specific and horrifying template of exactly what Japanese forces were capable of doing to prisoners they judged at risk of imminent liberation. The Palawan massacre, which had occurred in December of 1944, when Japanese guards on that separate island murdered American prisoners, specifically to prevent their liberation by advancing American forces, provided American intelligence and command staff with concrete, recent, and deeply alarming evidence of exactly what fate might await other Japanese-held POW camps, as American forces continued their advance through the Philippines. This specific precedent transformed the question of Cabanatuan's prisoners from a matter that might have otherwise been addressed through the ordinary pace of conventional military advance into an urgent operational priority, demanding immediate and decisive action. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, selected to lead the raid, brought a demanding and exacting command standard to the 6th Ranger Battalion's preparation for the mission, insisting on rigorous physical conditioning and detailed rehearsal, specifically because he understood that the operation's success depended entirely on the raiding force's ability to move quickly and silently across considerable distance while maintaining the tactical precision a surprise night assault against a defended camp. Mucci reportedly told his men directly that failure was not an acceptable outcome, given what was known about the Palawan massacre, a framing that left no ambiguity about the stakes involved for the men his force was being sent to rescue. The task of planning and executing a rescue fell to the newly formed 6th Ranger Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, supported by the specialized reconnaissance unit known as the Alamo Scouts, and, critically, by Filipino guerrilla forces under Captain Juan Pajota, whose local knowledge, intelligence networks, and combat support would prove absolutely essential to the raid's ultimate success. The operation required infiltrating a raiding force roughly 30 miles behind active Japanese lines, a distance that demanded the raiders move entirely on foot through terrain controlled by Japanese forces, avoiding detection for the multiple days the approach march would require, while gathering the detailed intelligence about the camp's specific defenses and guard routines needed to plan an actual assault with any realistic chance of success. The Alamo Scouts, a small, specially selected reconnaissance unit trained specifically for exactly this kind of deep infiltration mission, conducted the initial close reconnaissance of the camp itself in the days immediately preceding the raid, moving even closer to the objective than the main Ranger force to confirm the specific details of guard positions, patrol schedules, and the physical layout of the camp that the raid's final assault plan would depend upon. A reconnaissance effort conducted under conditions of extreme risk, given how easily discovery this close to the objective could have compromised the entire operation before the main assault force even arrived. Filipino guerrilla intelligence proved indispensable to this planning process, providing detailed and current information about Japanese troop movements, camp guard schedules, and the broader tactical situation in the surrounding countryside that American forces, operating without an established presence in the immediate area, had no independent way of gathering themselves. This close operational partnership between American Rangers and Filipino guerrilla forces, built on relationships and trust developed over the preceding years of occupation and resistance, represented one of the more significant examples of joint American-Filipino military cooperation to emerge from the entire Philippines campaign. An additional and genuinely fortunate complication in the operation's timing involved the presence of a substantial Japanese combat force encamped near the raiders' planned approach route, a force whose location was not fully known until the raiding party was already well into its approach march, requiring a last-minute route adjustment and a full day's delay to avoid detection. A change in timing that, while adding risk and uncertainty to an already complex operation, ultimately allowed the raid to proceed once the immediate Japanese threat had shifted position. A piece of battlefield fortune that several accounts of the raid have specifically highlighted as one of several moments where the operation's success depended as much on adaptable improvisation as on the original planning itself. Stop and consider the specific tactical problem the raid's planners actually faced, because a straightforward frontal assault risked exactly the outcome the entire mission was designed to prevent. If Japanese guards had even brief warning that an attack was underway, they might have time to execute the very massacre the raid was racing to forestall. The plan that emerged called for a precisely coordinated night assault, with Ranger forces approaching the camp under cover of darkness and launching a sudden, overwhelming surprise attack specifically timed to eliminate the Japanese garrison before any organized resistance, or, critically, any opportunity to harm the prisoners could develop. Pajota himself possessed detailed, current knowledge of the camp and surrounding area, gathered through his guerrilla network's ongoing operations in the region over the preceding months, intelligence that proved decisive in identifying the precise timing that would offer the raiders the best opportunity for surprise. Since Pajota's information indicated a specific pattern in Japanese guard routines and troop movements that the raid's final timing was deliberately built around, a level of tactical detail no American reconnaissance effort operating without established local presence could plausibly have gathered independently within the operation's compressed planning timeline. Filipino guerrilla forces under Pajota played a crucial supporting role in this plan beyond intelligence gathering alone, positioning themselves to block key roads and bridges that Japanese reinforcements might otherwise use to reach the camp once the attack began. A defensive screen that needed to hold long enough for the Rangers to complete the camp assault and begin the difficult process of moving hundreds of weakened prisoners away from the area before Japanese forces could organize an effective counterattack or pursuit. The raiders approached their final assault positions in the closing hours before the attack, crawling the last stretch of open ground toward the camp perimeter. A slow, exposed, and nerve-wracking final approach that several Rangers later described as among the most tense moments of the entire operation. Since any premature discovery at this stage, with the assault force still exposed in the open and not yet in position to launch the coordinated surprise attack the entire plan depended upon, could have triggered exactly the kind of panicked Japanese response the raid was specifically designed to prevent. The raid itself, launched on the night of January 30th, 1945, achieved almost complete tactical surprise against the Japanese garrison holding the camp. A Ranger assault force striking with such speed and coordination that organized Japanese resistance collapsed within minutes of the attack's opening, before guards had any meaningful opportunity to organize the kind of systematic execution of prisoners that had occurred at Palawan weeks earlier. Japanese forces at Cabanatuan, apparently not anticipating an attack of this scale or precision so far behind their own lines, were caught in a state of readiness entirely inadequate to the assault actually delivered against them. A tactical outcome that historians studying the raid have consistently attributed to the exceptional planning, rehearsal, and intelligence preparation the Rangers and their Filipino guerrilla partners had conducted in the days leading up to the operation. A low-flying American aircraft, arranged specifically as part of the raid's plan, passed over the camp in the minutes before the ground assault began, its engine noise deliberately intended to mask the sounds of the Rangers moving into their final attack positions, and to distract Japanese guards' attention skyward at the exact moment the ground assault force needed those same guards focused elsewhere. A small but carefully considered piece of tactical deception that several accounts of the raid credit with contributing meaningfully to the surprise the ground assault ultimately achieved. Filipino guerrilla units simultaneously executed their portion of the plan, engaging and delaying Japanese forces attempting to move toward the camp in response to the sounds of the attack. A supporting action that proved every bit as essential to the raid's ultimate success as the direct assault on the camp itself, since any significant Japanese reinforcement arriving before the Rangers could complete the rescue and begin withdrawing could have transformed a successful liberation into a prolonged and costly firefight with the newly freed, but still critically vulnerable former prisoners caught in the middle. The Rangers' entry into the camp itself, once the perimeter guard positions had been eliminated in the assault's opening seconds, revealed a scene that several participants later described as almost surreal in its combination of violent, decisive combat action against the remaining Japanese defenders and the immediate, urgent need to locate and begin evacuating prisoners who, in the confusion and darkness of a sudden nighttime assault, did not always immediately understand that the armed men now moving through their camp were American rescuers rather than some new and unexplained danger. Some prisoners, according to multiple accounts collected after the raid, initially reacted to the sudden eruption of gunfire and the appearance of armed men in the darkness with fear and confusion rather than immediate relief, a reasonable response given years of captivity under Japanese guards who had, in various documented instances throughout the camp's history, subjected prisoners to arbitrary violence, and it took Rangers precious minutes in several cases to convince disoriented, terrified prisoners that liberation, rather than some new danger, was actually what was unfolding around them. The rescue itself, once the camp's Japanese guards had been eliminated or driven off, revealed the full scope of the physical condition American planners had anticipated, but that still shocked many of the Rangers directly encountering the liberated prisoners for the first time. Men so severely weakened by years of malnutrition and disease that a significant number could not walk unassisted, requiring Rangers to carry or support them during the difficult process of evacuating the camp and beginning the return journey toward American lines. The physical evacuation of the freed prisoners, spanning the roughly 30-mile return journey to American lines, took considerably longer than the raid itself, and demanded a level of continued Filipino civilian support and cooperation that extended well beyond the initial provision of transport carts, with villages along the route providing food, water, and additional assistance to a column of former prisoners and their ranger escorts that remained, for the duration of this return journey, still technically operating within contested territory where Japanese forces might yet attempt to intercept or attack the vulnerable, slow-moving group before it reached genuine safety. Filipino civilians in the surrounding countryside contributed carabao-drawn carts to help transport the weakest prisoners, a piece of essential improvised logistics that proved as critical to the operation's ultimate success as the tactical planning that had made the initial rescue itself possible. The raid succeeded in liberating more than 500 American prisoners, while sustaining remarkably light casualties among the raiding force itself, a result that naval and military historians studying the operation have consistently identified as one of the most successful prisoner rescue missions in the history of American military operations. An outcome achieved through the combination of precise intelligence, careful rehearsal, and the essential, close cooperation between American Rangers and Filipino guerrilla forces that made the entire operation possible in the first place. The specific casualty figures from the operation, remarkably favorable given the scale and complexity of what had been attempted, reflected the precision and effectiveness of the surprise achieved, with the Ranger force sustaining only a small number of casualties while eliminating the entire Japanese garrison holding the camp. A lopsided outcome that military historians studying special operations throughout history have consistently cited as an unusually clean tactical success relative to the substantial risks the operation's underlying concept. A small force, operating deep behind enemy lines against a defended objective, would ordinarily be expected to carry. For the rescued prisoners, many of whom had survived the Bataan Death March nearly 3 years earlier, only to endure the subsequent years of captivity at Cabanatuan, the raid represented a liberation that arrived after an ordeal few outside their own ranks could fully comprehend. Men who had watched friends die on the march, in the disease-ridden early months at Camp O'Donnell, and through years of continuing malnutrition and forced labor, finally freed through an operation whose speed and success meant they avoided the massacre that had already claimed prisoners at Palawan just weeks earlier. Medical treatment for the rescued prisoners began almost immediately upon their reaching American lines, with military physicians confronting a population whose combination of severe malnutrition, untreated chronic disease, and the general physical toll of nearly 3 years of harsh captivity presented treatment challenges considerably beyond what conventional battlefield medical care was typically prepared to address, requiring specialized nutritional rehabilitation protocols and extended hospitalization for many of the men before they could be safely returned to the United States for further recovery and, eventually, discharge from military service. Several of the rescued men, in post-war accounts and interviews, described the psychological difficulty of processing sudden liberation after years of captivity, a transition that, for men whose bodies and minds had adapted to survive under conditions of chronic deprivation and constant fear, required its own extended period of physical and psychological recovery even after the immediate danger of the camp itself had passed. Hampton Sides's widely read History of the Raid, published decades after the war and drawing extensively on interviews with surviving Rangers and rescued former prisoners, helped introduce the operation to a broad popular audience that had largely lost familiarity with the specific details of the mission over the intervening decades, presenting the raid not merely as a tactical case study, but as a deeply human story of men who had endured years of captivity, finally finding rescue through the combined courage and skill of American Rangers and their Filipino guerrilla partners. A narrative approach that later informed a feature film adaptation, bringing the story to an even wider audience in the years that followed the book's publication. The Great Raid at Cabanatuan became, in the decades following the war, one of the most celebrated and frequently studied special operations of the entire Pacific Campaign, a case study in military academies of how precise intelligence, careful planning, and genuine operational partnership between conventional forces and irregular guerrilla units could achieve a result that a more conventional military approach might never have accomplished in time to prevent tragedy. Juan Pajota and the Filipino guerrilla forces who played such an essential role in the raid's success received, in the years and decades following the war, a level of formal recognition that many historians and veterans of the operation itself have argued remained disproportionately modest relative to the actual contribution these forces made. A broader pattern of under-recognition affecting Filipino guerrilla and resistance contributions across the entire Pacific War that historians specializing in the Philippines campaign have worked in recent decades to help correct through more thorough documentation and public acknowledgement of exactly how essential Filipino resistance networks were to numerous American military successes throughout the occupation and liberation of the islands. The raid's legacy extended directly into how the United States military approached subsequent prisoner rescue and special operations planning for decades afterward, establishing tactical and planning principles that would inform special operations doctrine well beyond the specific historical circumstances of the Philippines campaign itself. Remember the question this story opened with: how do you rescue 500 starving, often barely mobile prisoners from behind enemy lines without alerting the enemy in time for a repeat of the Palawan massacre? The honest answer, drawn from the specific documented sequence of that January night, is that it required exactly the combination this story has traced: painstaking Filipino guerrilla intelligence gathering months in the making, an Alamo Scouts reconnaissance effort willing to risk detection at point-blank range, a diversionary aircraft overhead at precisely the right moment, and a Ranger assault so fast and so completely coordinated that the camp's Japanese garrison never had the chance to do what their counterparts at Palawan had already done to other American prisoners just weeks before. If you want to understand how a raiding force 30 miles behind enemy lines managed to rescue more than 500 men from a fate that had already claimed other American prisoners just weeks earlier, and what happened to the survivors of the Bataan Death March who finally found freedom at Cabanatuan, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.